president in the late 70s, Jimmy Carter, is the next presidency we need to talk about. Believe it or not, there was a president in between President Nixon and Carter, and that was Gerald Ford, who had been President Nixon's vice president and replaced him in office in August of 1974 when Nixon resigned. He finished Nixon's second term. Now, not only had he been tied to Nixon, his name was attached to Nixon for having been his vice president. Ford also pardoned Nixon of all crimes against the United States in September of 1974. This meant that Nixon was going to be getting away with the crimes that he had committed during the Watergate scandal. That's very controversial, and it all but assured his defeat in the 1976 presidential election, in which he lost to Georgia Governor Jimmy Carter. You can see Ford here on the left and Carter on the right. Now, the Carter presidency itself was rough economically, and to no real fault of Jimmy Carter himself. The nation was going through a very prolonged period of severe stagflation, important vocab term. There was no economic growth at the time, very stagnant economy, hence the stag part of the new vocab term, and then very high inflation, hence the flation part of the stagflation vocabulary term. So no growth, high inflation, so that's eating at people's wages, and throughout his presidency, he's suffering the blame. It really wasn't his fault, but sitting presidents often suffer the blame for the current conditions of the nation. So a lot of the irresponsible spending on social programs and on the Vietnam War during President Johnson's presidency later plagues President Carter. And so even though it wasn't his fault, he definitely is dealing with the burden of stagflation throughout his presidency. The biggest drag on the economy was the 1973 energy crisis, which was the effect of an OPEC oil embargo against the United States. Now, even though this embargo happened previous to his presidency, the effects and the after effects, the lingering effects of this, really harmed the economy during Carter's presidency. There was another energy crisis caused by the upheaval in the Middle East by the 1979 to 1981 Iran hostage crisis, in which Iranians took U.S. hostages. Carter was failing to negotiate U.S. diplomats' release from their radical Muslim captors, and this really hit his reputation hard as well. So there was not only oil price and gas price issues due to the Middle East controversy, but also the thought of the president not doing enough to protect U.S. diplomats being held hostage overseas. So Jimmy Carter was really dealt quite a difficult hand to deal with as president, and stagflation was probably the biggest weight around his neck, followed by the Iran hostage crisis. Now, one success of the Carter presidency is one of the first attempts at a formal peace agreement between Israel and Egypt called the Camp David Accords. It was named this because the Israeli Prime Minister Menachem Begin and the Egyptian President Anwar al-Sadat, so here is Begin, here is Sadat, and you can see President Carter here in the middle, and they all met at the presidential retreat at Camp David. Hence, that's the name of the Camp David Accords. This was, however, rejected by the United Nations for not allowing for the participation of the United Nations or the Palestinian Liberation Organization, which was the native Palestinian population to Israel prior to the creation of the State of Israel after World War II. And they represented the interests of Palestinians in the area, and they were not allowed to participate. They were actually considered to be a terrorist organization, and so they were not allowed to be participants, and the United Nations said, you know, you didn't include us, you didn't include the PLO, and therefore we're not going to ratify this treaty. Which leads us to the election of 1980. Not only had the two energy crises and the Iran hostage crisis hurt Carter's reputation, but conservatism really seemed to be winning over the United States after more than 40 years of liberal policies. Conservative Republican presidential candidate Ronald Reagan, who was formerly governor of California, campaigned against Carter on many issues and successfully campaigned against Carter on these issues. He wanted to lower taxes. He wanted to cut back the size and scope of the federal government so it would be less invasive in people's lives. He wanted the 10th Amendment, which outlined states' rights, to be more respected, so the federal government should let states handle things a lot more. He declared that the U.S. should be unmatched militarily to offset the power of the Soviet Union. And he believed in the U.S. returning to a gold standard with its currency. Now, that is the one thing that was never achieved during Reagan's presidency. Many of the other things were high priorities. Carter was absolutely trounced by Reagan in the 1980 election. Not only were some of these ideas Reagan was campaigning on popular, but Carter, as we mentioned before, with stagflation and oil embargoes, energy crises, hostage crises, Carter just had too many weights hanging around his neck as president to be successful. It's really a shame because Jimmy Carter, of all people who ever served as president of the United States, is probably one of the most wholesome people. He's a great person. After his presidency, he founded Habitat for Humanity, and even as an elderly man today in 2022, he still participates on job sites for Habitat for Humanity. So a wonderful person, just had a very, very rough presidency and will not be remembered as one of our greatest presidents, despite being one of the greatest people to serve as president. That's the end of the Carter Presidency presentation. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to reach out. Otherwise, I'll see you in class.